Friday the 13th isn't just a day of bad luck, it's a day when something watches, waits, and creeps just out of sight. Tonight, we uncover the true horrors hiding in the shadows. Story 1. Witness. I remember the night Tyrone Blackwood was shot like it happened yesterday. You don't forget something like that, not when you were there, not when you saw it unfold. But my memory, it doesn't feel real. It's fractured like pieces were deliberately taken from me. Or maybe something doesn't want me to remember it all. It was September 7th, 1996. Midtown was alive, pulsing with energy. Fight night always did that to the city. Crowds spilled onto the streets, laughing, shouting, filling the air with chaotic excitement. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd promised myself I'd stay out of trouble that night. But promises are easily broken when something draws you in. That something was Tyrone. Tyrone Blackwood wasn't just a name, he was a force. You could feel it when he walked into a room, an invisible charge that made people look, made them stop breathing for a second. That night, I spotted him outside the Luxor, surrounded by his entourage. Flashy cars, louder laughter, and the kind of arrogance only someone like him could carry. But something was off. I noticed it right away. Tyrone wasn't smiling like he usually did. He glanced over his shoulder every few seconds like he was looking for someone, or something. I told myself it was paranoia. Even a man like Tyrone had enemies. But now I know it was something else. I stayed close enough to watch, but far enough to blend into the crowd. His sleek black sedan pulled onto the strip, the bass of his music thumping like a heartbeat. I followed on foot, something inside me whispering, urging me to keep going. And that's when I saw it, the gray Chrysler. It rolled up slowly, unnaturally quietly like it was gliding. The windows were tinted darker than they should have been. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. Four men sat inside. I caught glimpses of their faces as the streetlights flickered, but none of them looked normal. Their skin was too pale, stretched too tight over their bones. Their eyes didn't reflect the light. The man in the back seat on the left, he was the worst. His head was tilted at an odd angle like it was too heavy for his neck. His eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, and when he smiled, my stomach turned. It wasn't a human smile. It was wide and unnatural, and his teeth looked like shards of broken glass. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I felt like I was caught in a web, trapped in a moment I couldn't escape. The Chrysler pulled up beside Tyrone's car at the red light. Time slowed. The street went eerily silent, no music, no chatter, not even the sound of engines. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath. And then came the gunfire. It wasn't just the sound of bullets. It was the air. It felt like it cracked open, like something invisible and heavy had slammed into the street. People screamed, but their voices sounded far away, distorted like they were underwater. Tyrone didn't even flinch. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, and looked directly at the man in the back seat of the Chrysler. Not with fear. Not even with anger. but with recognition. He mouthed something. I swear I saw his lips move, but I couldn't make out the words. And then he slumped forward, blood splattering the inside of the windshield. The Chrysler didn't speed off like you'd expect. It glided away, almost leisurely, like it had all the time in the world. I should have run then, should have left the scene, and never looked back. But I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, and my head was pounding. As I stood there, frozen, I swear I heard a voice. Not a whisper, not a shout, but a deep, resonant voice that felt like it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It said one word, watch. The streetlights flickered back on, and the noise of the city returned in a rush. Sirens wailed in the distance. People ran, but I stayed, rooted to the spot. Something caught my eye, a piece of paper fluttering under Tyrone's car. I don't know why I picked it up, but I did. It wasn't paper at all, it was a photo. A photo of Tyrone sitting in his car, taken that very night. But in the background, you could see the Chrysler. And in the window, the face of the man with the black eyes, smiling directly at the camera. I burned the photo that night. I should have felt relief, but I didn't. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows stretched too long in the corners of my room. Whispers danced at the edge of my hearing. And then, a month later, I saw the Chrysler again. This time, it was parked outside my apartment. Empty. Waiting. I don't entirely know what happened to Tyrone that night. But whatever it wasn't just a shooting. Something followed him. And now, I think it's following me. If you ever see a gray Chrysler, don't stop. Don't look inside. And for the love of God, don't let it see you. Story 2. The Silent Hunger. I don't talk about the mountains anymore. Not to friends, not to family. Not even to myself. What they know is the story the media fed them, a tale of bravery, survival, and triumph against impossible odds. They see the 15 of us who made it out as heroes. But I see something different when I look in the mirror. I see a ghost. A creature the mountain twisted into something it should never have been. The world called it a miracle we survived 70 days after the crash. But miracles don't leave shadows that follow you home. They don't echo in your head long after the screaming stops. If surviving was a miracle, then it was the kind born of nightmares, fed by the worst parts of the human soul. The crash was over in seconds, but its memory lingers like a scar that won't heal. One moment, the plane soared above the clouds, laughter and chatter filling the cabin. The next, the mountains loomed, giant, silent sentinels. When the metal screeched, and the plane lurched violently, we all knew. It felt like the mountains themselves had reached out and grabbed us. When I woke up in the snow, the world was silent. Not peaceful, suffocating. There was no sound of birds, no distant rustle of trees. Just the wind, screaming as it whipped through the wreckage. There were 42 of us on that flight. By nightfall, fewer than 30 remained. By the second week, the mountain began to claim the rest. The first few nights were the hardest. The cold was merciless, draining every ounce of warmth from your body. We huddled together in the wreckage, wrapping ourselves in torn clothing and seat covers, trying to conserve what little heat we could. But the cold wasn't the only thing alive up there. At first, it sounded like the wind, low and mournful, weaving through the cracks in the fuselage. But it wasn't the wind. The whispers started quietly, barely audible beneath the howl of the storm. They came in fragments, impossible to understand, but they grew louder with every passing night. Some of us dismissed it as our minds playing tricks. Others swore they heard voices calling their names from the snow. By the third night, no one wanted to be alone. Hunger came next. It gnawed at us relentlessly, turning the living into shadows of themselves. At first, we tried to stave it off with whatever we could find: snow, strips of leather, pieces of insulation. But the mountain doesn't care about desperation. It laughs at it. I'll never forget the moment someone suggested it. Santiago. He didn't look at any of us when he spoke, staring instead at the bodies lying in the snow outside. We have to survive, he muttered, almost to himself. They wouldn't want us to die. No one responded. We didn't need to. The silence that followed was louder than any argument could have been. The next morning, it was done. No one talked about it, but we all knew. It wasn't just survival, it was something darker. The first bite tasted of shame, of surrender. But hunger doesn't care about morality. The whispers changed after that. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words. Clear, sharp words that crept into your thoughts and twisted them. I started to dream of food, rich, steaming meals, but when I reached for them, they turned into something else. Flesh. Blood.by the fourth week, we weren't alone anymore. It started with the footsteps, soft crunching sounds in the snow that circled the wreckage at night. At first, we thought it was animals, but then Maria swore she saw someone. A figure, tall and thin, standing at the edge of the wreckage. They're watching us, she whispered, her voice trembling. We dismissed it as delirium. But that night, I saw it too. It stood far enough away that I couldn't make out its features, but there was something wrong about it. Its limbs were too long, its movements unnaturally smooth. It didn't walk so much as glide across the snow. And its eyes, two endless pits of black, seemed to peer straight through me. When I blinked, it was gone. The mountain changed us. Not just our bodies, our minds. Luis started to mumble to himself, his lips moving silently as he stared at the shadows. Natalia became withdrawn, refusing to speak or eat. One night, I woke up to find her standing outside, barefoot in the snow, staring at the mountains. They're calling me, she said, her voice distant. I can hear them. When I tried to pull her back, she resisted, her eyes wide with terror. Don't you see? She screamed. We're not supposed to be here. The next morning, she was gone. The red cloth appeared after that. We found it tangled in the wreckage, tied around pieces of debris, even wrapped around our own limbs. It was impossibly bright against the endless white of the snow, almost glowing. At first, We thought it was from the plane, but then it started appearing in places it couldn't have been. One night, I woke to find it wrapped tightly around my wrist. I ripped it off and threw it into the snow, but when I turned around, it was lying on my pillow. When Tomas and Javier volunteered to hike for help, we didn't think they'd make it. By then, the whispers were constant, the shadows circling closer and closer. Every step they took felt like a farewell. The night before rescue came, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. I woke up to find the shadow standing over me. Its face, or what passed for one, was inches from mine. Pale, smooth, and featureless, it tilted its head as if studying me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then it reached out, one long, skeletal finger brushing against my cheek. When I woke up, it was gone. But the mark it left burned. They called us heroes. Survivors. But they don't know what we left behind, or what followed us. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the whispers again. I find the red cloth in places it shouldn't be, tucked into a drawer, tied to my bedpost. And every now and then, I see them. Shadows, standing at the edge of my vision, waiting. The mountain doesn't let go. It never does. Story 3. The Unseen Passenger. I don't know why I survived that night when no one else did. Some people call it fate. Others say it was sheer luck. But I know the truth. Something was on that plane with us, something that didn't belong. And it didn't let me go out of mercy. October 13, 1972, was supposed to be just another routine flight. Aeroflot Flight 217, Moscow bound, full of passengers eager to get home. Families with children, businessmen with briefcases, elderly couples holding hands. I was just a flight attendant, 24 years old and still new to the job. The day had been uneventful, clear skies, no delays. But something felt off from the start. The passenger in row 23. It started when we were boarding. Most passengers smiled politely or ignored us altogether as they filed in. But then there was him, the man in row 23. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, his frame stooped awkwardly to fit through the narrow aisle. He wore a dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild autumn weather, and his face was obscured by the brim of his hat. "Good evening, sir," I said, offering a practiced smile. He didn't respond, just turned his head slightly, as if studying me. His face was pale, his skin stretched tightly over sharp cheekbones. His eyes, dark and unblinking, locked onto mine for a moment too long before he moved to his seat. Something about him made my stomach twist. The first half of the flight was uneventful. Passengers dozed off or read newspapers, the cabin filled with the hum of engines and quiet chatter. But somewhere over the countryside, things started to change. It began with the lights. They flickered once, twice, then went out entirely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Gasps and murmurs spread through the passengers, but the lights came back a moment later, steady and bright. We chalked it up to turbulence, though there hadn't been any. Then the temperature dropped. It wasn't subtle. One moment, the cabin was warm and comfortable. The next, it was freezing. Passengers wrapped themselves in jackets and scarves, their breaths visible in the air. I glanced toward the cockpit, but before I could move, a child screamed. He was pointing toward row 23. "He's not real," the boy cried, burying his face in his mother's coat. I turned to look, but the man in row 23 wasn't there. His seat was empty. By the time we began our descent into Moscow, the atmosphere on the plane had shifted entirely. The air felt heavy and oppressive, like something unseen was pressing down on us. I walked down the aisle, checking on passengers, but everyone seemed wrong. Faces pale, eyes wide, as if they could feel it too. When I reached row 23, I froze. The man was back in his seat, but he wasn't sitting. He was hunched over, his long arms draped across the seat in front of him. His head turned slowly as I approached, and I swear I heard him whisper something, though I couldn't make out the words. "Sir, are you feeling all right?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled, a thin, unnatural curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. As we neared Moscow, the plane began to shake. At first, it was subtle, barely noticeable, but it quickly grew worse. Luggage tumbled from the overhead compartments, passengers screamed, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, trying to reassure us. But I knew something was wrong. The man in row 23 was standing now, his head tilted at an impossible angle. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and his lips moved soundlessly, as if reciting a prayer, or a curse. The shadows in the cabin grew darker, stretching and twisting unnaturally. I swear they were alive, moving on their own, crawling up the walls and across the floor. One by one, passengers began to slump in their seats, their heads lolling to the side as if they'd fallen asleep. But their eyes were open, staring blankly ahead. I ran to the cockpit, but the door wouldn't budge. Through the small window, I saw the pilots slumped over their controls, unmoving. The last thing I remember is the ground rushing up to meet us. The plane hit the earth with a deafening crash, metal screeching and tearing apart. Then, silence. When I woke up, I was lying in the wreckage, surrounded by snow and fire. Bodies were strewn everywhere, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. But there was no sign of the man in row 23. The investigators said it was a mechanical failure. Some blamed pilot error. But I know what I saw. Something boarded that plane with us, a creature, a shadow, a curse. Even now, I can still feel its presence. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear whispers in the dark. And every so often, I see a figure in the distance, tall, thin, and wearing a dark coat. Watching. Waiting. I don't think I survived that crash. Not really. A part of me is still up there, in the shadows of that wreckage. And one day, it's going to come back for the rest of me. Story 4. The Babysitter. I was 16 when I first met David Holloway. He wasn't anyone special, just a quiet man who rented a room down the street from us. He worked odd jobs, mostly handyman stuff, and occasionally helped neighbors with babysitting or errands. My mom liked him. Said he was polite and dependable, always willing to lend a hand. But there was something about him that always made my skin crawl. I couldn't explain it back then. Maybe it was the way he smiled without it reaching his eyes, or how he seemed to linger just a little too long in the shadows. It was almost as if he was always waiting, watching, measuring something. Still, in a small town like ours, you didn't question people who seemed to fit in. It was April 1973 when the Holloway children died. I should have stayed away. I should have listened to that nagging sense that something wasn't right, but I didn't. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. The Holloways had gone out to dinner and left their 3 kids, Sophia, Lily, and little Ben, with David. I just finished my shift at the diner and was walking home when I passed their house. The windows were lit up, but the curtains were drawn tightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the upstairs window. It wasn't David. It wasn't one of the kids. Something made me stop. Maybe it was the eerie stillness, or the faint, metallic smell in the air. It reminded me of copper, of blood, but I couldn't place it. My mother had always told me to trust my gut, but curiosity got the better of me. I knocked on the door. David answered after what felt like an eternity. His shirt was unbuttoned, his hands slick with something dark. For a split second, I thought it was grease or paint. Then I saw the red stains creeping up his sleeves, dark, thick, almost black in the dim light. "They're sleeping," he said, his voice low and flat, like it was being dragged out of him. He didn't even ask why I was there. Behind him, the hallway stretched into darkness. It felt colder than it should have been, damp and heavy, like the house had been holding its breath. The metallic smell grew stronger, nearly choking me. I should have turned around. I should have run. But something in his eyes, cold, dead, held me in place, like I was locked inside a cage I hadn't noticed until that moment. "I just wanted to check on the kids," I managed to say, forcing the words past my dry throat. David tilted his head, his lips curling into a thin smile. It was wrong, too wide, like it had been stitched onto his face. "They're playing a game," he said. The words made my skin prickle, like he wasn't just speaking them but forcing them out, as if they were foreign to his mouth. That I stepped inside. The house was freezing, far colder than it should have been in April. The walls seemed to close in, and the dim light from a single bulb stretched long, twisting shadows that writhed along the floor like snakes. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear a faint dripping sound, rhythmic and slow, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something awful. The living room was empty, but the furniture was askew, as if something, or someone, had been thrown across the room. A child's doll lay in the corner, its head twisted at an unnatural angle, staring at me with cold, lifeless eyes. "David," I whispered, "where are the kids?" He didn't answer. Instead, he motioned toward the kitchen with a slow, deliberate sweep of his hand. The smell hit me first, sharp, metallic, sickly sweet. Blood. It was everywhere, smeared across the walls, pooling on the linoleum floor in dark, uneven puddles. The smell was thick, suffocating, like it was alive in the air, crawling into my lungs. At the center of the room was the dining table, and on it lay a crude, twisted symbol carved into the wood. It looked ancient, wrong, like something that didn't belong in this world. The lines twisted and curved in a way that made my head spin, as if the wood itself was alive and waiting. And then I saw them. The children were in the basement. I don't remember opening the door or walking down the steps. My feet moved on their own, carried by some invisible force, like I was a marionette with my strings cut loose. All I remember is the sight of them, Sophia, Lily, and little Ben, sitting in a perfect circle on the cold, damp floor. Their eyes were wide open, but lifeless, empty, staring blankly at the symbol etched into the dirt in front of them. David stood behind them, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the walls. He was holding something, a knife, jagged and crude, the blade glinting faintly in the dim light. The shadows seemed to shift around him, pressing closer as if drawn to the power of the knife. "They're part of it now," he said, his voice strange, almost guttural, like it wasn't his own. The shadows in the room began to move, twisting and writhing as if they had a life of their own, a life far older than anything I could comprehend. One of them broke away, stretching upward until it formed a shape, a figure, impossibly tall and thin, with limbs that bent and cracked at impossible angles as it moved. Its face, or lack of one, was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. It was smooth, featureless, save for a gaping void where a mouth should have been, a chasm of blackness that seemed to stretch into infinity. The creature moved toward the children, its elongated fingers reaching for them. I screamed, but my voice seemed to dissolve in the thick, oppressive air, swallowed by the shadows. I felt a coldness deep in my chest, like the very essence of my being was being drained from me, stolen by something far older than time. David turned to me then, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, like two cold, dead embers. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a whisper that scraped against my bones. The thing in the shadows froze, its head snapping toward me. In an instant, it was inches away, its cold breath washing over my face, filling my lungs with a freezing void. I felt its fingers brush against my skin, icy and sharp, like needles digging into my flesh. For a moment, I thought I was going to die, to be consumed by that empty face. But then I ran. I don't know how I made it out of that house. The air outside was thick with a heaviness I couldn't shake, like the house had followed me, lingering in the corners of my vision. The last thing I remember is the sound of David's laughter, a low, hollow sound that echoed in the darkness, mocking me. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the children's bodies displayed outside the house, their lifeless faces turned toward the sky. The symbol was burned into the ground beneath them, its edges still smoldering with a faint, unnatural glow. The smoke didn't rise, it twisted, coiling back into the earth like it was being pulled down by some unseen force. David was gone. Vanished. Not a trace. No sign of him anywhere. They called him the Monster of Worcester, said he was a madman, a drunk who'd snapped. But I know the truth. He wasn't the monster. It was still in that house. Waiting. Watching. That thing in the shadows, it never left. It was still there, feeding off the terror, the darkness, the blood. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see it, tall and thin, its empty face watching me, waiting for the moment I'll come back, because I don't think I really escaped. Not completely. Sometimes, I hear the whispers when I try to sleep. The sound of a child's laugh, faint and distant, but still so very close. And the smell of blood. It's always there now. Following me, trailing behind me like a shadow of its own. I can't shake the feeling that it's waiting for me to return. And when I do, it will take me. Story 5. The Void Beneath. Daz Baxter was the kind of man who would cross the street if he saw a ladder leaned against a wall, avoid cracks in the sidewalk, and recoil at the sight of a black cat. Superstition wasn't just a quirk for him, it was his religion. He'd seen too much, he told anyone who asked. He believed the world had rules hidden in its shadows, and breaking them came at a cost. But his obsession with Friday the 13th went far beyond simple caution. "It's not just bad luck," he once said to me, his eyes wide and glassy. "It's a day when the cracks between this world and something else get thinner. Things slip through." I laughed it off back then, humoring him with a pat on the back and a playful jab about tinfoil hats. But when Friday the 13th rolled around in October 1976, his fear seemed to take on a life of its own. The day started like any other. I stopped by his apartment in the morning, expecting to see him fretting over his talismans and charms, but this time was different. He wasn't just careful, he was terrified. "I'm not leaving this bed," he announced as I walked in. The room was dark, the windows covered with heavy blankets. Candles burned on every available surface, their flickering light casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. On his bedside table sat a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a weathered book with no title, its pages filled with strange symbols and cramped handwriting. "Daz, you're overreacting," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's just another day." He shook his head violently, his hands clutching at the edges of the blanket. "It's not. Not for me. You don't understand. I've seen what happens." I didn't argue. There was no point when he got like this. "I'll bring you some food later," I offered, hoping to lighten the mood. "Don't," he said, his voice low and strained. "You shouldn't come back here. It's safer for you if you stay away." By noon, the building began to feel off. The air in the hallways grew heavy, almost suffocating, and the pipes groaned deep within the walls as if the building itself were alive and in pain. Neighbors whispered about strange sounds coming from Daz's apartment, low murmurs, like chanting, and an occasional thud that rattled the ceiling below. I ignored it at first. Daz was always a bit eccentric, and I assumed his paranoia was feeding into his imagination. But by late afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. I went to check on him again, despite his warning. The hallway outside his door was eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you second-guess your every move. I knocked, but there was no response. "Daz?" I called out, pushing the door open. The apartment was even darker than before. The candles had burned low, their wax dripping like tears onto the furniture. The air smelled stale, thick with the metallic tang of something I couldn't quite place. I found him in the bedroom, still in bed. But something was wrong. His face was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were fixed on the ceiling, unblinking. His lips moved rapidly, forming words I couldn't understand, his voice barely above a whisper. "Daz, are you okay?" I stepped closer, my stomach twisting. He didn't respond. His gaze shifted slightly, not toward me but toward the corner of the room. I followed his eyes, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows. The corner seemed darker than it should have been, the blackness almost alive, shifting and pulsing as if it were breathing. And then it moved. A shape began to emerge, stretching upward. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, bending at unnatural angles. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a smooth void, broken only by a faint ripple, as if something was pressing against it from the inside, desperate to escape. "Don't move," Daz croaked, his voice hoarse and trembling. The creature didn't lunge or attack. Instead, it hovered, watching, its head tilting in slow, deliberate movements. The shadows around it seemed to expand, creeping along the walls and floor, swallowing the dim light. "Daz, what is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's here for me," he said, tears streaming down his face. "It's always been here. Watching. Waiting for the right moment." The floor beneath his bed creaked, the sound sharp and jarring. A jagged crack appeared, spreading outward like a web. The room seemed to tilt, gravity pulling toward that growing fissure. I tried to grab him, to pull him out of the bed, but he screamed and thrashed, his strength far greater than I'd expected. "You can't stop it," he cried. "It's too late." The crack widened, and a foul, damp smell filled the room. From the depths of the fissure came a sound, a low, guttural groan, like the earth itself was alive and in agony. The creature in the corner began to dissolve, its form collapsing into the shadows. But its presence didn't leave. If anything, it became stronger, its essence seeping into the room, into the air, into me. The bed collapsed suddenly, dragging Daz into the void below. His screams echoed as he disappeared into the darkness, the sound abruptly cutting off as the floor sealed itself behind him. I stumbled back, my body trembling uncontrollably. I tried to run, to escape, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows wrapping around me, suffocating me. I could hear the same groaning sound from the floor beneath, like something was trying to claw its way out. I finally managed to stumble out of the apartment, my breath ragged, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't look back. When the police arrived hours later, they found nothing. No cracks in the floor, no candles, no strange symbols. The apartment was spotless, almost sterile, as if it had been scrubbed clean of any trace of Daz or his belongings. They told me he must have left town, that he'd been spiraling for years and finally decided to disappear. But I knew better. I knew the truth. Every Friday the 13th since I've heard it, the low groan, the hum of something deep below. And in the corner of my bedroom, the shadows sometimes move. I don't dare sleep with the lights off anymore. The cracks between this world and whatever else waits below are still there, waiting, watching, creeping. And I can feel it, it is still here. It never left. Story 6. The Phantom Voyage. I was a cabin boy aboard HMS Endeavour, but everyone called her HMS Friday, a name we whispered like a curse. The ship was an experiment, a challenge to the age-old maritime superstitions that had gripped sailors for centuries. The Admiralty wanted to prove that Fridays weren't cursed, that the sea didn't care about the whims of men. They took every step to mock the legends. The keel was laid on a Friday. Captain James Friday was appointed to lead the ship. And on the most infamous day of all, Friday the 13th, the Endeavour set sail from Portsmouth. But the sea has its own rules. The morning of our departure, the harbor was unusually quiet. The usual chatter and laughter among dockworkers were replaced by murmurs and wary glances. A cold fog clung to the water, and even the gulls seemed reluctant to call out. As we boarded, I noticed the crew's unease. Some of the older sailors carried charms, rabbit's feet, rosary beads, even nails pried from coffins. Captain Friday, however, was unbothered. He stood tall on the quarterdeck, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon. "The sea doesn't care for your fears," he barked. "We make our own fate." We set sail at noon, the tide pulling us out into open water. The fog thickened as the coastline faded, swallowing the ship in a dense, oppressive gray. By evening, the mood had soured. The crew whispered of strange sounds echoing below deck, distant knocks, scraping against the hull, and faint, guttural moans. "I heard it last night," said McAllister, an old sailor with a face like weathered oak. A voice, low and cold, calling my name. "You're drunk," someone muttered, but no one laughed. That night, I couldn't sleep. My hammock swayed gently with the motion of the ship, but the air was heavy, and the silence felt unnatural. I heard it then, a faint knock, like fingernails tapping against the hull. It came from the waterline, moving steadily along the length of the ship. The next day, we found the first signs of trouble. The starboard lifeboat was gone, its ropes cleanly severed. Captain Friday dismissed it as sabotage by a cowardly crewman, but his tone lacked conviction. That afternoon, the wind died. The sails hung limp, and the ship drifted aimlessly on a glassy, motionless sea. The fog returned, thicker than before, curling around the ship like a living thing. It muffled every sound, even the creak of the timbers. Then came the smell, foul and choking, like rotting seaweed mixed with something metallic. That night, we heard the screams. It started below deck, a single cry that rose and fell before cutting off abruptly. The crew rushed to the lower hold, lanterns in hand, but found nothing except a foul stench that clung to the air. "Where's Harris?" someone asked. No one knew. By morning, 2 more men were gone. The captain ordered a full search of the ship, but there was no trace of them. The remaining crew grew restless, muttering about curses and vengeful spirits. Captain Friday grew harsher, barking orders and threatening punishment for anyone caught spreading rumors. But even he couldn't deny the truth, the ship was no longer ours. On the third night, I saw it. I was on watch, standing near the bow, when I noticed movement in the water. At first, I thought it was just the fog shifting, but then I saw the shape, long, sinuous, and impossibly large. It rose slowly, a shadow darker than the night, with eyes like dim, yellow lanterns that seemed to pierce through the mist. Its body glistened, slick and serpentine, as it coiled around the hull. I stumbled backward, my throat dry with terror, as a sound rose from the depths, a low, mournful wail that vibrated through the ship's timbers. The crew rushed to the deck, their faces pale in the flickering lantern light. Captain Friday stood at the helm, his expression unreadable. "What do we do?" someone shouted. The captain didn't answer. He was staring at the water, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. The following morning, we found his hat on the deck, soaked and torn. Captain Friday was gone. The remaining crew huddled together, whispering prayers and clinging to their charms. The fog was thicker than ever, and the ship seemed to drift aimlessly, as if caught in an invisible current. By the fifth day, I was one of the last left. The creature came for us one by one, its shadow slipping through the fog, its voice whispering promises and curses. Some men jumped overboard, driven mad by the voices. Others simply vanished, leaving behind only the faint echo of their screams. On the sixth day, the Endeavor was silent. I stood alone on the deck, staring into the fog. The creature was waiting. I could feel its presence, heavy and unrelenting. I don't remember much after that. When I woke, I was drifting in a lifeboat, miles from anywhere. A passing merchant ship found me days later, delirious and half-mad. No one believed my story, of course. The Endeavor was never found, and the Admiralty buried the tale under layers of bureaucracy. But I know what I saw. The sea doesn't care for our rules, our beliefs, our defiance. It has its own laws, its own predators. And some things are better left undisturbed. Story 7. The Phantom of Room 13. I never believed in superstitions. Friday the 13th was just another day, and bad luck was something people created for themselves. Or so I thought until the night I stayed in room 13. It was late, and I was tired after a long drive. The highway had been blanketed in fog, and the small, nondescript hotel on the outskirts of town felt like a refuge. The desk clerk, a gaunt man with sunken eyes, handed me the key without a word. Room 13, I read aloud, half laughing. You don't skip the number. His eyes flicked up, and for a moment, I thought I saw fear in them. But he said nothing, just slid the key across the counter and turned away. The hallway leading to my room was dimly lit, the flickering bulbs casting long, shifting shadows. Room 13 was at the very end, its brass numbers dulled and uneven, as if they'd been hastily nailed in place. As I unlocked the door, a faint chill swept over me. Inside, the room was surprisingly ordinary, plain beige walls, a small desk, a single bed. Yet, something about it felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the silence was absolute. Even the hum of the hallway lights seemed to vanish once the door clicked shut. I tried to sleep, but the room wouldn't let me. The clock on the nightstand ticked louder than it should have, each second dragging like nails against glass. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, twisting and bending as if alive. At 3:13 a.m., I woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The air was freezing now, my breath visible in the dim light. I felt it before I saw it, a presence, heavy and watching. In the corner of the room, something moved. At first, it was just a faint ripple, like heat waves distorting the air. But then it grew darker, coalescing into a tall, indistinct figure. It had no features, just a void where its face should have been. It stood there, unmoving, its presence filling the room with an unbearable weight. Paralyzed, I watched as it raised a hand, or something like a hand. It pointed to the wall opposite the bed, where faint, glowing symbols began to appear. They twisted and writhed, forming shapes I couldn't understand but instinctively feared. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure moved closer, its form growing more defined with each step. It carried an aura of despair, a suffocating wave of dread that made my chest tighten. Then it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was a cacophony of whispers, each one overlapping the other, in languages I couldn't comprehend. But one phrase stood out, repeated over and over: "You were warned." The symbols on the wall began to glow brighter, pulsating like a heartbeat. The air grew thick with the stench of sulfur and decay. The figure reached out, and the room seemed to tilt, reality warping around its touch. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I bolted for the door, throwing it open with all my might. The hallway was empty, eerily quiet, but I didn't stop. I ran down the stairs, past the front desk, and into the cold night air. When I looked back, the hotel was gone. The next morning, I found myself in my car, parked by the side of an empty road. My watch read 6:13 a.m., but my phone had no signal. I drove back to town, desperate for answers. When I asked about the hotel, the locals gave me strange looks. "There's no hotel out there," one man said. "It burned down years ago. A fire started in room 13, killed the man inside." I didn't tell them what I saw. I don't know if they would have believed me. But sometimes, late at night, I still see the symbols in my mind. I still hear the whispers. And I still wonder, was I warned? Or was I marked? Story 8. The Curse of Black Friday. They say curses linger long after their origins are forgotten, their echoes reverberating through the ages. If you've ever wondered why Friday the 13th fills so many with dread, let me tell you about the legend of Black Friday, the day the Knights Templar fell. The year was 1307, in the waning light of autumn. King Philip IV of France, drowning in debts owed to the Templar Order, concocted a scheme to erase his obligations. On Friday, October 13th, he ordered the mass arrest of the knights, branding them heretics and traitors. Templar strongholds across France were stormed before dawn. The knights were dragged from their beds, their cries muffled by the chilling clang of steel and the shouts of Philip's soldiers. Those who resisted were executed on the spot, their blood staining the cold stone floors of their once sacred halls. But it wasn't their deaths that birthed the curse. No, it was what came after. The arrested Templars were subjected to unimaginable tortures, designed not just to break their bodies but to shatter their very souls. Under the flickering light of torches, inquisitors twisted their limbs, burned their flesh, and whispered promises of salvation if they would only confess to blasphemy and devil worship. And confess they did, some out of agony, others out of madness. Yet the more they confessed, the more grotesque the accusations became. Stories spread of shadowy rituals in catacombs, of unholy symbols etched in blood, and of something, a horned figure with hollow eyes that seemed to stare into the abyss. Rumors reached the ears of King Philip himself. They said the Templars had consorted with something ancient, something not of this world. They claimed their treasure was not gold but knowledge, knowledge forbidden, dark, and dangerous. One by one, the knights were sentenced to death. The pyres were built high, their flames stretching toward the heavens as if to mock the god the Templars once served. The air in Paris grew thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning flesh. It was on the eve of Jacques de Molay's execution, the Grand Master of the Templar Order, that the curse was spoken. Bound and beaten, de Molay stood before the flames, his voice hoarse yet defiant. "You have condemned the innocent," he spat, his words carrying through the gathering dusk. "And for this sin, you and your line shall be cursed. From this day forth, no king shall prosper, and this date, this day of betrayal, shall be marked with misfortune for all who dare to mock the divine." As the flames consumed him, witnesses claimed they heard more than the crackling of wood. Some said they heard laughter, low and guttural, as if something hidden in the shadows was watching, reveling in the carnage. Others swore the horned idol's hollow eyes glowed faintly, as though it too was present, bearing witness to the ritual. The curse seemed to take root almost immediately. King Philip's health began to deteriorate, his nights plagued by dreams of burning knights and hollow-eyed idols. Within a year, he was dead, as was Pope Clement V, the pontiff who had sanctioned the Templars' demise. But it didn't stop there. Over the centuries, those who meddled with the remnants of the Templars' legacy met untimely ends. Explorers searching for their lost treasure vanished without a trace. Scholars attempting to decipher their cryptic symbols went mad, scrawling incomprehensible warnings on their walls before succumbing to violent deaths. And then there are the stories, whispered among the few who dare to delve into Templar lore. Stories of strange occurrences on Friday the 13th. They say that on that cursed day, those who dwell too close to the Templars' secrets may see glimpses of their fate. A flickering shadow in the corner of their vision. A faint smell of burning flesh. The sound of 1,000 voices chanting in a language no human tongue can form. Some claim the curse transcends time, that the Templars' final rituals bound their tormentors, and all who live under their dominion, to an unbreakable cycle of dread and ruin. Others say the idol the knights once revered was not destroyed, that it still watches, waiting for the day it will rise again. In the 1800s, a farmer in southern France claimed to have unearthed an artifact from the Templar ruins, a small, horned statue with hollow eyes. His family reported strange occurrences after bringing it into their home, livestock found mutilated, the farmer wandering into the woods at night and speaking in tongues, and a fire that eventually consumed the house. The statue was never found. More recently, historian researching Templar artifacts was found dead in her study on Friday the 13th, her body surrounded by cryptic symbols carved into the floor. The authorities claimed it was a deranged act of self-mutilation, but witnesses spoke of a figure lingering in the shadows, a tall, horned silhouette with glowing eyes. So, the next time Friday the 13th rolls around, remember this tale. Remember the cries of the burning knights, the defiance of Jacques de Molay, and the laughter in the flames. And if you smell smoke, or hear a whisper in the dark, pray that the curse hasn't come for you. Story 9. The Curse of the 13 Club. Superstition has always intrigued me, not because I believe in it, but because I don't. Or at least, I didn't. Growing up, I was the one who boldly walked under ladders and broke mirrors to prove nothing would happen. Bad luck was for the weak-minded, I thought. But then I heard the story of the 13 Club. It began as an innocent discovery during a late-night study session in the dusty archives of my university. I was researching old urban legends for a paper on societal fears, and that's when I stumbled upon a crumbling newspaper clipping from 1883. It described a group of intellectuals mocking superstition by forming a club dedicated to defying it. They called themselves the 13 Club. The clipping mentioned their lavish meetings and bizarre rituals, dining in groups of 13, spilling salt on purpose, walking under ladders. The article was written with a playful tone, mocking the group's antics. But scrawled in faint pencil at the bottom of the page was a single sentence: "Be careful what you challenge, sometimes it answers." The phrase stuck with me. I felt compelled to dig deeper. The 13 Club was founded in New York in January of 1882 by a man named Samuel "Lucky" Parsons, a wealthy businessman with a disdain for anything he deemed irrational. He recruited 12 other men, bankers, lawyers, and scholars, to join his crusade against superstition. They held their first meeting on the 13th of the month, dining under a massive chandelier adorned with broken mirrors and black ribbons. The evening was full of deliberate provocations. They spilled salt across the table, toasted with glasses cracked at the rim, and dined with knives crossed on their plates. Each member signed a ledger declaring they would never fear omens, curses, or anything beyond their understanding. The group quickly gained notoriety, and their meetings became more elaborate. They even published accounts of their exploits in local newspapers. At first, it seemed like harmless fun. But then the misfortunes began. Charles Morton, one of the founding members, was the first. A respected lawyer, Morton was known for his sharp wit and skepticism. One evening, he was found dead at the foot of his home staircase. The coroner ruled it an accident. He'd slipped and fallen, but something about the scene didn't sit right. His body was discovered clutching a shard of broken mirrors. It hadn't been there earlier in the evening, and no one could explain how it got into his hand. The others dismissed it as coincidence. They continued to meet, doubling down on their rituals. By 1884, their gatherings were grand affairs held in the ballroom of the Hotel Marlowe, a once opulent building with an unsettling reputation. At their fifth meeting, held on Friday the 13th, the hotel staff reported hearing strange noises coming from the ballroom, faint whispers, scraping sounds, and what one mate described as laughter, but not from human throats. The club members laughed it off, attributing it to nerves and overactive imaginations. But that same night, the hotel's kitchen caught fire. The flames spread quickly, consuming the entire west wing. 3 members of the club perished in the blaze. Witnesses claimed the fire moved unnaturally fast, as though it had a will of its own. When the wreckage cooled, investigators found symbols scorched into the ballroom floor, patterns that didn't match any known cause of fire. After the fire, some members quit the club, fearing they had gone too far. But others, led by Parsons, insisted they were simply unlucky. "Superstition feeds on fear," Parsons said. "And we will not feed it. But fear doesn't need to be fed to find you." By 1887, the 13 Club had dwindled to 7 members, and the tragedies kept coming. Dr. Henry Lawson, a prominent surgeon and one of Parsons' closest friends, drowned in his own bathtub. His wife claimed she heard him talking to someone just moments before his death. The words he spoke were incoherent, but his tone was frantic, as if he was begging. Another member, George Winslow, died when his carriage overturned on an empty road. The horse was found miles away, still harnessed but frothing at the mouth, its eyes wide with terror. The remaining members were beginning to believe they had awakened something. The final meeting of the 13 Club took place on December 13, 1889. By then, their gatherings were no longer celebratory, they were desperate. Only 5 members remained, and they were determined to end whatever curse they believed had been unleashed. They gathered at Parsons' estate, each bringing offerings they hoped would appease the unseen force that haunted them, amulets, religious artifacts, even handwritten apologies. The housekeeper later reported that the men seemed deeply afraid. That night, the estate was eerily silent. At dawn, the housekeeper knocked on the door to the meeting room. When there was no response, she entered. The room was empty. The chairs were overturned, the tablecloth shredded, and the floorboards blackened with strange, looping symbols. A faint smell of sulfur lingered in the air. Parsons and the others were never seen again. I'd like to say I stopped researching the 13 Club after that, but I didn't. I couldn't. There was something about their story that felt unfinished, as though it was waiting for someone to uncover the final piece. But strange things began happening. My research notes vanished, only to reappear in odd places, under my bed, in the freezer, once even inside my locked car. Books fell from shelves without explanation. One night, I woke to find my mirror cracked, though I hadn't touched it. Then the dream started. In my dreams, I was seated at the 13 Club's table. The room was dimly lit, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke. Across from me sat a shadowy figure. It had no face, but its presence was suffocating. It reached out with long, thin fingers and pushed a cracked glass toward me. "Drink," it whispered. I woke gasping, my chest tight and my throat dry. I haven't looked into the 13 Club since. I avoid ladders, refuse to break mirrors and stay home on Friday the 13th. Some might call me paranoid. But I know better. If you ever find yourself laughing at superstition, remember the story of the 13 Club. And if you feel something watching you, or hear a faint, mocking laugh in the dead of night, don't look for its source. Some things are better left unseen. Story 10. The 13-step stairs to the other side. It was a cold night when I first heard the story of the 13-step stairs. A local legend, passed down through generations in my small Midwestern town, about a cemetery that hid a dark secret, a secret that only those brave enough, or foolish enough, would dare to uncover. The cemetery was old, far older than the town itself, nestled on the edge of a forest that seemed to swallow any sound or light that ventured too close. People talked about the cemetery in whispers. It wasn't just the age of the gravestones or the eerie stillness of the place that unnerved people, it was the staircase. The locals called it the 13-step stairs, though no one really knew when it had first appeared. It was said to be an old stone staircase, crumbling at the edges, hidden in the far corner of the cemetery. There were 13 steps, nothing more, nothing less. And on one night every year, Friday the 13th, those who were brave or desperate enough to climb the stairs would witness something unimaginable. The legend told that on this fateful night, at exactly midnight, the stairs would lead you to the underworld. People who had tried to climb those stairs before would often return with hollow eyes, muttering about things they had seen, things that couldn't exist, things that weren't meant to be seen. But even worse, some never came back at all. The first time I heard this story, I laughed it off. I was skeptical, just like everyone else at the bar that night. The old man who told it to me, a grizzled former soldier named Elias, had eyes that seemed too knowing, too far away. He described the staircase as if it were alive, something that breathed and shifted as if the world around it didn't matter. The townspeople avoided it, as if the very ground around it was cursed. That night, something gnawed at me. The more Elias talked, the more the idea of the 13-step stairs lodged itself in my mind. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a challenge, a temptation. By the time Friday the 13th rolled around, I couldn't resist. I gathered a few friends, people just as skeptical as I had been, and we made our way to the cemetery after midnight. The air was thick with fog, the moon barely visible behind clouds, casting a faint, ghostly light over the gravestones. We found the staircase easily. The crumbling stones stood in sharp contrast to the well-kept gravestones around it. It was as though the staircase had no place here, like an anomaly frozen in time. The steps were narrow and uneven, and the first few were so overgrown with moss and vines that they were nearly invisible in the dark. A chill ran down my spine as I took the first step. My friends laughed it off, cracking jokes to mask the tension in their voices. But as soon as I placed my foot on the second step, something changed. It wasn't just the sudden silence around us, or the strange pressure in the air. It was the feeling that something unseen was watching, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up that I looked up at the top of the stairs, but something had changed. The top of the stairs no longer led to the old cemetery. It was as if the air itself had parted, revealing a vast, dark landscape that stretched endlessly into the horizon. The ground beneath my feet was still stone, but beyond it was a vision of hell. The sky was crimson, swirling with angry clouds that crackled with electricity. In the distance, shadows, monstrous, distorted figures, moved against the storm, their movements jerky and unnatural. The ground was barren, cracked open like the earth had split itself apart. Fire flickered in the distance, but it wasn't warm, it was cold, an empty, consuming cold that seemed to suck the life from everything near it. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. My breath caught in my throat as a voice whispered, "No," screamed, into my ear, a voice I couldn't understand. I turned to my friends, but they were frozen, their eyes wide in terror, their faces pale. One of them, Tim, opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The others looked as if they were seeing the same thing, the same nightmare. Their faces were contorted in horror, but they couldn't move. We were trapped in a vision, or perhaps trapped somewhere far worse. I didn't understand what happened next. I don't even remember climbing down the steps. It's as if everything around me turned into a blur. One moment, I was on the stairs, and the next, I was standing outside the cemetery, my friends gone, my body drenched in sweat, my mind reeling. The morning after, I tried to tell myself it was all just a nightmare, a hallucination. But the truth was far darker. The cemetery was sealed off when the police arrived. They found my friends' cars still parked by the gates, but the bodies were nowhere to be found. No trace. No footprints. Nothing. And when I returned home, I found something that chilled me to my core. In my bedroom, on the mirror, was a symbol, one of the symbols I'd seen on the ground in that dark place, carved into the surface. It was crude, jagged, like someone had scratched it with their nails. I haven't been back to the cemetery. I haven't been back anywhere near those 13 steps. But I know this, whatever I saw that night wasn't just a vision, it was a warning. Something waits beyond those stairs. And if you ever find yourself standing at the bottom of the 13-step stairs, don't look up. Don't take that first step. Because once you do, there's no turning back.